Hello, everyone. Welcome to our next installment in the Cosmos Society Open House series. Our guest today is Joel Christensen, Professor of Classics at Brandeis, a previous, I must say, contestant. You have appeared previously in this series, Joel, and this time you're talking with us about a topic entitled Beautiful Bodies or Beautiful Minds, Disability Studies in Homer. But before you start, since I wasn't the moderator for the first time you appeared on the show, I'd like to ask what got you into classics in the first place? Was there some inspirational moment early on, or was it always part of your life?
That's a good question. I think the answer is both, and yes and no. And so I've told this story a few times before, but I don't mind telling it again. I mean, basically, I grew up in rural Maine, and my father was deaf, and this actually might come up to be important later. And our life was really centered around the library, and reading and storytelling. We were pretty much kicked out of every library in southern Maine for overdue fines eventually, but I always loved literature. I was always drawn to it. And at some point early on, I decided I wanted to learn Latin because many of the authors I loved knew Latin. And I fell in love with Catullus at age 16, which I think is a good and ripe age to fall in love with Catullus. I didn't fully understand him, but I don't know if anybody does. And when I got to college, I pursued a classics degree and learned Greek because that's what one does when one wants to learn about literature. And again, some of my favorite authors from the time had classical education, so that's what I wanted to pursue. And then I started reading Homer in Greek, and from almost the first line of the Iliad, I felt it was something qualitatively different from anything I'd read before. And I said, well, I need to spend some time reading Homer to understand the canon, literature, the human mind. And 20 years later, I'm still trying to understand Homer. So maybe someday I'll turn to, a later author, but I don't know about that.
Thanks. So without further ado then.
Okay. Thank you. So today I'm going to go through some passages in the Odyssey, and I also want to adduce a literary theoretical framework from disability studies to Homer for one of, I think, the first times, and to try to make the argument that it's an important way to think about the Iliad and the Odyssey, and it helps us to understand not just the dynamic of the epic itself, but some of our inheritance coming from the Western tradition when it comes to discourse about human bodies and about marginalized peoples, and about what it means in the Western tradition to be fully human. So with that, I have a handout I posted online, and I'm just going to start by focusing on the passages. I'm always going to be a text person. So the first passage is Zeus's opening lines from the Odyssey. And Zeus says, after Athena comes to him, or before Athena speaks to him in the Odyssey, he's looking down on the story of Aegisthus. And he's looking at Aegisthus and he says, mortals, they're always blaming the gods and saying that evil comes from us when they themselves suffer pain beyond their lot because of their own recklessness. Now, for several years now, as I've been working on the Odyssey, these opening lines have struck me as paradigmatic for the epic as a whole. They don't necessarily need to explain everything about the Odyssey, but I think they're supposed to function as a refrain that hangs around in the audience's heads while we view the events of the Odyssey, while we think about the actions, and while we think about the relationship between the divine and the human. And what I also think is important is the way that these lines reconfigure the question of fate from the Iliad. They say it's not simply pure determinism that the gods decide what's going to happen, but there's also not a pure free will. There's a complex relationship between the fate or the chance that we encounter and the decisions we make. And as far as being a complex statement on human morality and action and responsibility in the world, I think it's the most sophisticated thing we see in early Greek culture up until the time, and even through the time of the pre-Socratics. It really demands that the audience think about that intricate relationship of dependencies between what we are when we're born and what we're given in the world and what we do with it. Right? So that's sort of my opening frame for thinking about the Odyssey. And the thing I really want to emphasize in it is that expression of human agency, right? Whatever we're given by fate, by the gods, by the bodies we're born into, the Odyssey proposes that we still have agency in the choices that we make. And in my other readings of the Odyssey that I've been working on some time, where I look at Odysseus and Telemachus, what I've noted is that their ability to reclaim agency or exercise it in the world is critical for their ability to achieve kleos or homecoming, to really become full beings in the epic's terms. But one of the problems with this formulation, if we're trying to think about reading the Odyssey in the modern world, is the question of whether or not this allegedly universal principle applies to everyone within the epic's world. If to be fully human, if to be given full agency is to make your own choices, what does it mean if you're conditioned or sort of created and deployed in epic discourse as someone who's incapable or punished for doing so? So to just reflect again on that opening statement, what Zeus says is, he says that mortals suffer hupemeron, beyond their fate, sphasin atastaliasin, because of their own stupidity, wickedness, however you want to translate atastalia. And the reason this is such a critical line or formula for the epic as a whole is it comes up again in connection with discrete groups. It's applied first to the companions of Odysseus in the proem, where they're accused of ruining their homecoming because of their own wickedness. It's applied repeatedly throughout the epic to the suitors as they are eating up Odysseus's home and they get punished for it. And it is implied as a criticism of Odysseus as well. In the middle of his own story that he tells, his companion Eurylochus accuses him of suffering from atastalia in the cave of the Cyclops. So it's a critical thematic component of the Odyssey. But my problem is that it doesn't seem to be completely applied to the other people who suffer in the text, particularly the 12 handmaids who are hanged in Book 23, and Melanthius, the wicked slave who's mutilated. So that passage I've given you on item 2 on the handout, and it's Odyssey 22, 474 to 477. Where they take Melanthius out, and I'm quoting here, they take Melanthius out through the hall and into the courtyard. They cut his nose off and ears with pitiless bronze. Then they cut off his balls and fed them raw to the dogs, and they cut off his hands and feet with an enraged heart. Now, this moment is often seen, of course, as a moment of redress, where Odysseus is resettling things in his household. But earlier in the text, there's a moment where Odysseus himself where one of the suitors talks about a punishment that Odysseus will suffer if he fails to defeat the beggar Iris. And the same language is used, and this is handout 2B, to talk about the tyrannical action of King Echetos as he mutilates people. So near the end of the epic, there's a strange moment where we're asked to think about the mutilation of this servant, and it's followed by the mutilation of the handmaidens. In a longer version of this talk, I start with that moment, which I think is such a powerful inspiration for Margaret Atwood's Penelopiad. She talks about it in the introduction to her book, the strangeness of the fact that these handmaids are hanged and the problems with the epic discourse that comments upon it. So as I've looked at the Odyssey and I've tried to figure out Odysseus as a hero in Homeric terms and Odysseus as an agent in narrative terms, and how the whole world contains different people and different bodies described in different ways, I've struggled to come up with a theoretical framework that really helps us understand the totality of this world. And one that's become particularly attractive to me or pertinent is that of disability studies. Now, I know everybody watching won't know much about it, but of the people I can see in the screen, can you just raise your hand if you've heard of disability studies before? This is an informal. All right. So I think 1 of 8. All right. So disability studies, I've given you a little starter bibliography on it, is theoretical framework that's now used a lot in literary studies, especially in English, that draws on post-structuralist literary theory to think about the ways in which identity is created through a type of social practice. So where it is situated in postmodern studies in general within structuralism is the idea that the center is always using margins and the marginalized peoples to define the quality of the center. Right. So when we're talking about disability studies in particular, it examines cultural discourse to look at the ways in which we use what we used to call abnormal bodies to define what is a normal or ideal one. And one of the things that's important about disability studies as it's developed in the field is that it's become sort of a synoptic way for viewing marginalized people in general. And some of the people, especially Linton and Thompson on my handout, have showed in powerful ways how our cultural discourse uses the language of disability to limit and marginalize not just people who we might recognize as physically disabled, and not just those that we might recognize now as mentally disabled, but people who are culturally disabled by gender or race or sexuality specifically. And so in modern sort of cultural discourse, we'll talk about things like ableism. And the discourse of ableism really emerges out of the critical study of disability studies. And so for a while, I've especially teaching the Odyssey in classes, I've been thinking about the ways in which the Odyssey marks bodies and uses bodies as metonyms to limit the agency and authority of individuals in the world. So that's a starting point. Now on my handout number 3, I pulled out a couple quotes from some of my favorite authors on disability studies. The first one from Warner just sort of gives a broad idea of disability studies as a post-structural perspective. But then people who have applied the lens of disability studies to other literature have extracted some things in the way we depict marginalized peoples in our discourse. So one of the things that happens in the representation of disabled characters is that they're not agents. They become objects in texts, sort of narrative devices for marking things about the real agents or the real heroes. And Thompson focuses well on that. Linton also writes, and this is the third one, that disabled people are those to be provided for, given to, and helped. Reading the narrative as a whole, disability is something to take action on, not something to reflect on. Yet, although disabled people are victims, not actors in the story, disability itself has agency, intention, and power. So in the cultural discourse, the thing that people suffer itself is a character or force in the world, whereas the people are just victims in it. And what really resonates with me in this formulation is Zeus's comments at the beginning of the Odyssey. In our own culture, just as in the Odyssey, misfortune is configured as something that happens to us and that we have to endure or rise above. But in the worst form of sort of abling discourse, people with disabilities are denied even that opportunity. They are marginalized from agency and narrative control. And this is especially important for Greek culture. Not many people have used disability theory to look at ancient Greek literature. There have been some recent studies looking at the representation of actual disabilities and handicaps in the ancient world. And there have been some great studies on that. But we're really at the beginning of applying the theory to literature in the same way that our colleagues in English and cultural studies have done. But there's a real opportunity to rethink Greek physiognomy. So in the ancient world, as much of us know from studying it, there's this assumption that if you look good, then you are good, right? There's a direct connection between nobility and beauty and baseness of character and baseness of appearance. And so for me, and what I want to talk about in the next 15 minutes before we turn to questions, is how this dichotomy or say overlapping dichotomy emerges in Homer and what happens with it. And just to sort of cut to the chase there, in the Iliad, we see the clear physiognomic dichotomy we'd expect. Beautiful people are good and heroic, ugly people are not. And so I'll talk about their Thersites. But in the Odyssey, something changes. right? Especially with the character of Odysseus, who gets to, let's say, play act at being disabled and disfigured. There's a reconfiguration of what it means to be noble for Odysseus, which also means a reconfiguration of the cultural discourse of the body. So I'm going to get to there and then, of course, show, I think, a little more how that's problematic. All right. Is everyone with me so far? I know. Okay. Some nodding heads. I know that. I hope that wasn't too bewildering. You can ask some questions in a bit. All right. So in item 4 on the handout, I call it Homer on heroic bodies. And this is a really famous scene, right? And I just want to focus on Thersites' description in the Iliad. So Thersites is introduced as the ugliest man in all of Troy, right, among all the Achaeans, right? And we should immediately remember who the most beautiful man of all the Achaeans is, and that is Achilles. And it describes him halfway through. Well, first it talks about what he says. He has disordered things in his thoughts. He strives pointlessly with the kings out of order, and he says whatever he thinks might be amusing to the Argives. So we have this sort of carnivalesque element to Thersites, right, that would go with sort of early American freak shows. Right, the grotesque makes us laugh. It's there to entertain us. But then it goes from being amusing to being more threatening. He was the most shameful man who came to Troy. He was cross-eyed and crippled in one foot. His shoulders were curved, dragged in towards the chest. And on the top, his head was badly shaped and the hair on his head was sparse. Right, so I guess he's every medieval man's fear of what will happen as he ages, right? His shoulders come in, loses his hair. But there's this direct connection between his ethical content and his physical character, right? And this is sort of provides the baseline for Homeric heroic beauty. If you go to item 4B on the handout, I picked out a couple places from the Iliad and the Odyssey where this is re-emphasized. When Athena comes to Telemachus in book 1 of the Odyssey, she says, I see that you are really big and noble, and be brave, so that a man born in the future might speak well of you. This is Odyssey 1:302. So again, there's this direct connection. You look good, therefore you should be good. Therefore, you deserve to be remembered in the future. And remember, in the economy of Homeric kleos, all that matters, until the end of the Odyssey, I think, is that you get this immortal renown. And this, of course, doesn't just come in the Odyssey. Telemachus is repeatedly recognized for how beautiful he is, how big and strong he is. And Helen recognizes him and says of his resemblance to Odysseus, I was just now thinking that this too, Menelaus says this too, wife, as you note the similarity. These are the kinds of hands and feet, the eye glances and head and hair belonging to that man. And that man in this case is Odysseus, which is a weird thing to say. Like, my son kind of looks like me, but I wouldn't look at his hands and his feet and say, those are my hands, those are my feet. Although my wife said that about his feet, so maybe I'm wrong there, right? And this happens in other places as well. Back in the Iliad, I already said that Achilles is the most beautiful man, and he notes this himself. In a famous scene in book 21, he meets the Trojan Lycaon in battle, and Lycaon begs to be rescued. And Achilles says, don't you see what kind of a man I am? How beautiful and big? And then he goes on to say, I'm going to die, therefore you, sir, should die too. All right. So far, what I'm arguing is that there's this correlation deployed in the Iliad between heroic beauty, heroic excellence, and finally the attainment of kleos. And in the Iliad, at least, I don't see that it's questioned at all. It's just there. Ugly bodies are ugly people who don't deserve fame. Right? And this isn't just about not being physically attractive. It has to do with bodies that function in a world of war. When we get to the Odyssey, as I've already anticipated with Telemachus, this theory, or let's say this cultural discourse, maps out as well, at least through his character. And you have this interesting moment where there's even a stratification in the world of servants. In passage C under 4 in the handout, Eumaeus is speaking to Telemachus, to Odysseus in disguise, and he says, look, the servants in the house are not the sorts of servants that you are. They are young, well clothed with tunics and cloaks. They have clean hands and fine faces, those who serve the suitors. So even in the world of the Odyssey, where we're outside of war, There's a sense to which your place in the world is written on your body for other people to read. Now, when we think about the Odyssey, or think about Odysseus as a character, one of the things that's most important about him is, in fact, that his experiences are written on his body, literally, right? He's old. His legs are weakened by years on sea, and he has a scar that he has to hide lest his identity be revealed. So that's the starting point for me for saying that there's an exception to the Odyssey's rhetoric, the Iliad's rhetoric of beauty. The Odyssey is doing something different. And this exception is teased out, it's pointed to before we even get to see Odysseus's scar. And this comes to the fore before Odysseus mentions his name, and this is in item 5 in the handout. In book 8, Odysseus is in the hall of Alcinous and the Phaeacians, and the Demodocus, the bard, sings a song, and Odysseus cries, and Alcinous says, let's go outside and have some postprandial entertainment. And the entertainment includes athletic contests, eventually some dancing and ball playing, but it starts in some sort of, like on Thanksgiving, you go out, play a little football to work up an appetite or make yourself puke or something. So they go out, and Odysseus is watching them play games, and one of the princes starts pushing at Odysseus, saying, why don't you compete in these games, old man? Or do you not know any athletic games? Are you a pirate who just goes around stealing stuff? Now, this gets Odysseus a little upset. I think he gets upset because he is actually a pirate. But he gets upset because he's been insulted. And he says, and this is item A, friend, you don't speak well. You seem like a reckless man. The gods don't give charming things to all people in this way, not in form or brains or ability to speak. For while one man is not exceptional in looks, a god crowns his form with words. People delight as they see him, and he speaks without hesitation in public with sweet reverence, and is conspicuous among those assembled, and they gaze upon him like a god when he goes through the city. Another is equal to the immortals in his appearance, but no charm sits well upon his words. Just so, your shape is excellent. Not even a god could make it better, but your mind is limited. You have raised the spirit of my dear chest by speaking against what is right. I'm no naif in sports as you least claim, but I think I was among the best when I could trust my youth in my hands. But now I am possessed by evil and pains. I've endured much, surviving the wars of men and the grieving waves. But even so, after suffering much, I will play your games. Your speech gnaws at my heart. You pissed me off by speaking. So after this, of course, Odysseus picks up the discus, throws it farther than any other men. Everyone's shocked. And Athena shows up in disguise and quips, even a blind man could see how far that's gone than the others. And then we move to Demodocus, the blind bard who's there, and then he sings a song. Now, for the Odyssey, this scene and the song that follows is intricately connected to its themes and interests. But I want to point out a couple things that happen here that connect, or really, let's say, stand against or correct the rhetoric of the Iliad. The first is that you are excellent because your body is excellent. This might be true for the world of the Iliad, where you die a glorious death, right, when you're young. But what happens when you survive? In many ways, the Odyssey, as a story of the homecoming, is the story of survival, what it means to survive, and who you are once you go home. And the fact is, the Odyssey makes pretty clear to us, you don't get to be young and beautiful forever, right? But does this mean you stop being good? A second thing that happens here, and that will emerge more clearly in the story that Demodocus tells about Hephaestus, Ares, and Aphrodite, is that we're plotting different human qualities of excellence against one another. Famously, of course, there's this tension in Greek myth between Ba, which is force, right, and Metis, which is intelligence. And in the Odyssey, of course, Odysseus embodies, in many ways, Metis, while in the Iliad, we can say Achilles embodies Ba, or force. And this dynamic is something many people have talked about before, and I think Greg Nagy, Best of the Achaeans, has a couple pretty interesting things to say about it. And I really build in that sort of structural dichotomy between them. But before going there, I just want to mention that what I see going here from a perspective of disability studies is that the Odyssey is correcting one notion, and that's that you are noble because your body is noble. It's saying, no, you're also noble because of your mind, which is interesting. But what it does is it replaces one set of uncontrollable values with another. Right, so the way in which the Odyssey adjusts the cultural discourse of disability to say it's not just about your body, it's about your mind, in order, in fact, to reinscribe or reassert a certain type of hierarchy, right, in which Odysseus, the experienced male hero returning home, still exercises the strongest form of culturally authorized discourse. But we can talk about that in a minute. So what happens next is that Demodocus, the blind bard who's been listening to all of this, sings the song of Ares and Aphrodite. And just in case everybody isn't clear about this, the basic story is that Hephaestus is suspicious that Aphrodite is having an affair with Ares, and so he sets a trap. Right, he puts some sort of intricate webbing in his bed chamber, and then he says to Aphrodite, "Hey, I'm going on a trip. I'll be gone a few days," and he leaves. Almost immediately upon leaving, she calls up Ares. He shows up. They get in bed. They start having sex, and the trap springs and traps them to the ceiling. Hephaestus comes around, calls the rest of the gods, and they stand there laughing at them. Eventually, Poseidon calls them out. But there are a couple moments in this from this long passage that goes from over 100 lines, 266 to 369. I pulled out two passages in item B. What was this? 4B. Sorry, 8B. Yeah, whatever number I'm on. And the first one is this. So starting at 329, the passage runs, "Evil deeds do not succeed. The slow overtakes the swift. Just as now Hephaestus, even though he is slow, captured Ares, who is the swiftest of the gods, who inhabits Olympus with his tricks, even though he's crippled. Now Ares owes the penalty for adultery." Now, I think this is a supercharged moment in a couple ways. One thing I don't want to lose is that the authoritative voice singing this song is someone who is in fact disabled. Right? Demodocus is blind, but he is endowed with poetic authority. And there is this great sort of a compensatory logic that happens in Greek myth, where you lose one quality, you get another. And we see this a lot of times in bad narratives about disability, right? Is that you can't just be a person who has specific or personal qualities. You have to be exceptional in a way that's culturally authoritative. So the story is coming from someone who's already positioned outside the physical norm. And he's picking Hephaestus, who in many different ways is, of course, stand-in here for Odysseus. It's a story about about adultery, about a wife and a bellicose lover. And the language here, of course, echoes the sort of, let's say, putative conflict between Odysseus and Achilles. Because Achilles is faster than anyone else. And Odysseus is smart and clever. So as many people have seen this entire moment has sort of metapoetic reflections for the Odyssey's preeminence above other poetic traditions, right? And the way it does this is by reconfiguring the body, making an aging body acceptable by giving Odysseus compensatory intelligence, wisdom, and the ability to beat stronger, healthier foes because of his mind. So at the end of it, we have one more little marker that says the famous singer sang these tales. Odysseus took pleasure in his thoughts as he heard them, and so did the rest of the assured Phaeacians, those men famous for their ships. And it's important because this marks who the audiences are for this tale. Odysseus here is sort of the stand-in for us as the external audience. He's marking out that this tale is in some way pleasurable, and we're supposed to reflect on it. And the reason it's pleasurable is that Odysseus knows that Hephaestus is a stand-in for him, and we as the audience are supposed to follow that. And I think that we're supposed to move on from that heroic world of the Iliad where we have perfect bodies. We move on to the world where we all have the potential to be someone like Odysseus. Maybe. So what's interesting, though, is that this is not the last moment in which we're encouraged to think about the body in the Odyssey. What does happen is that Odysseus is disfigured in book 13. So in book 13, when he gets back to Ithaca, Athena comes up with a plan that often seems pretty wild to me. And the plan is you have to go in disguise to your household in order that you can make sure everything's going on all right, but also, and this is the part we often miss, so that you will be injured and offended, so you have a justification for murdering everyone, right? And Odysseus has to be put into a lower social position, and that lower social position can only be marked by the disfigurement of his body. So note, Athena says, and this is passage C, the last one, "Come, I will make you unknown to all mortals." Notice that unknown, agnoston, unrecognizable, but I think there's also a reflection that he has no fame once he loses the physical characteristics that he's known for. "I will shrink and wrinkle the beautiful skin on your bent limbs. I will ruin the fair hair on your head, and I'll dress you in rags which someone, when they see you wearing them, will hate. And I will darken your eyes, which were vibrant before, so that you will seem wretched to all the suitors and to your wife and child whom you left in your home." Now, she doesn't exactly turn Odysseus into Thersites. He doesn't have the bent shoulders and the misshapen head. I think he probably still has more hair than Thersites. But he does carry on typical marks of aging, right? And he is, let's say, disembodied from the heroic spirit so that he can go home and sort of play this role of the lower class. Now, the reason I think that this is important for the rest of the Odyssey is that one could make the argument, which I think is erroneous, that Odysseus shows that your physicalness doesn't matter, right? Instead, what happens here is that Odysseus puts on the equivalent of blackface for a disability, right? He puts on the appearance of being disabled. He takes these qualities. He plays this role as one of his tricks. This is his equivalence to the trick of Hephaestus in the story. He puts on the disguise, he plays the role so people don't expect him, and he ends up triumphing because of this. So Odysseus doesn't lose his metis at any point. He doesn't lose his heroic experience. Instead, he occludes it by putting on somebody else's body. And if you follow the logic of the text and the way that bodies are marked as abled or disabled, the distinction between Odysseus and the suitors is that Odysseus has had experience and that he has metis. So he has this newly culturally activated feature of not being disabled, the ability of the mind. So in the heroic discourse, you need both to survive, right? You need the body to conquer in war, the mind to survive. And everybody else is limited because of it. Telemachus doesn't have the experience or the mind. The suitors don't have the intelligence. And then the slaves and women are marked by having lesser bodies and lesser agency. So the Odyssey deploys a complex discourse about the body and the human mind as part of enforcing what I see as a different type of heroic and then eventually aristocratic hierarchy. And that's the assumption that still, if you come from a certain background, or if you inhabit a certain type of body, then you might also have metis. There's no sense, with the exception of Penelope, that other figures in the text get to have this. And if you follow the narrative, I think what happens in a more discreet and subtle way is that Odysseus repeatedly enacts upon the bodies of others in order to reassert his authority. And I think that this framework, in part, helps to explain why Melanthius has to be mutilated, why the suitors have to be physically slaughtered as violently as they are, and finally, why Odysseus and Telemachus feel that they must hang the 12 slave women. So that's my basic outline, sort of a prolegomenon to disability studies and Homer. I'm happy to, I'd love to start answering some questions now or talking about it.
Wonderful, thanks. That was a great introduction. I've got some questions, but I don't want to jump in myself, and you folks may have some. So someone raised their hand for their, Astrid, I see you raising your hand there. Why don't you, yeah. Oh, you're muted. Oh, now you're okay.
Okay. Could you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Hi,
Well,
Astrid.
thank you so much for this. I just want to ask you about Thersites.
Yes.
He's the guy who is being blamed for having torn out the eyes of Penthesilea in the Aethiopis, if I'm not mistaken. So he himself mutilated a body,
Yeah.
desecrate the body of a woman.
Absolutely.
And if I'm not wrong, he ended up being killed by Achilles.
Right.
Which is his antithesis.
So yeah, I've got to write this down. That is a great. Wasn't even thinking about that, and I just want to riff on that in a moment if I can. Right, because one of the interesting things about Thersites in the Iliad is that, as many people have observed, he kind of says the very same things Achilles does. Right. So if we think about him, it's not so much that he and Achilles are polar opposites. They're binary opposites. Right. They're sides of the same thing. It's just one is ugly. So Achilles gets to say what he wants to say because he's a hero. He's physically beautiful and he has the cultural authority. Thersites, on the other hand, says the same things, and he's beaten for it. So that's one thing I left out on that, is Odysseus is the one who physically abuses Thersites to put him back into place. So to the Aethiopis, I probably left that out because we don't have it, right? But from the perspective of myth, you're absolutely right. Like it reflects the same forces, right? Because Penthesilea, like her name is a replacement name for Achilles, right? It also means woe for the host. And in a way, she is the female equivalent of Achilles. So Thersites' disfiguring of her is a metonymic disfiguring of Achilles. And the only way to sort of set things right again is, of course, for Achilles to destroy him. And I think that it's not complicated symbolism to think about the most beautiful hero killing the ugliest one. Thank you, Esther. That's a great question.
Yes.
Yeah. Hi, Robert.
Sorry. I was muted, so I couldn't moderate. Okay. Please go ahead.
I'm curious on this question of disabilities. I would expect, given the nature of medical care and so forth at the time that these people were composing these things, that essentially everybody was disabled on a statistical basis.
Okay.
And so they were surrounded by people who had misfunctioning arms and legs and skin diseases and eyes. Right. And we look back at this, we think of it as a rare thing, but for them, this is an everyday, disabled people are an everyday experience, right?
Yeah. So what I would say from the perspective of disability studies, I think Thompson and Linton are both good about this, is that perhaps part of the reason that the disabled and disabilities strike us so deeply is because during our lives, if we live long enough, all of us will inevitably be disabled, right? Aging is a significant part of it, right? And that's just the process of aging. But on the other side, I would say that, there's a difference between the physical experience and the physical historical reality of disabilities and the cultural discourse about it, right? So let's say we were to just take a series of American television shows and advertisements and say, this is what Americans in the 21st century look like, right? Most of us would look at those pictures and say, well, that's not the case at all. Most people don't look that way. Yet our discourse is one that's constantly pushing certain skin colors, certain gender stereotypes all across the board, right? And those images shape the way we view ourselves and the way we act in the world towards others. So that's where I'd make the distinction between, let's say, the historical experience of disability and the difference in discourse. And then the assumption of what I think of a very fairly deleterious assumption of the equivalence between looking good and being good. So I also think back to what must have been physiological differences between aristocrats and common people based on the lives that they led, on not working in the fields, on having good nutrition. And it's something we can observe in our own country, in our own countries in the modern world, right? Working classes, migrant classes live different medical and nutritional lives than most of us do. Over the time in their lives, that story is written on their bodies. And so I think that the Greeks definitely would have had different assumptions and views than we did, and probably more familiarity with, let's say, those types of physical pains. But I don't think that means the cultural discourse would have been any less powerful. Does that make sense? Okay. I think
Maria.
Maria.
Go ahead.
Hi, Joel. Thank you very much for this really very innovative lecture. If I understood correctly, your argument is that at some point, I think that you connected disability with class, especially in the case of Odysseus. Have I heard it well?
Yes, so I think class can be rolled into disability, yes.
Yes. So on the one hand, if I understood you correctly, you said that Odysseus in a way had to be presented like to acquire a certain status of disability, in order, to to present himself to the suitors. Is that right?
Yeah. So
yeah.
that's part
On
of
the
it.
other, on the other hand, I was wondering, because I have a parallel in my mind. I have the myth of Pelops,
Okay.
who was, in a way, a person, with a prosthetic arm, because the gods ate, his shoulder. So how can we accommodate this? The fact, for example, that we have, for example, Hephaestus, who is a god, and we have also Pelops, who is the progenitor of Pelopites clan or family, that you have two conspicuous members who in a way represent, I can say, two different aspects or different perspectives of disability, either in the form of prosthetics, like in the case of Pelops, or in the case of, allow me to say the word of lameness, like in the case of Hephaestus, who in a way, as you rightly said, he ends up winning over Ares, because it is justified to acquire compensation for the adultery, the so-called adultery of his wife.
So I think that you're absolutely right that these, let's say, cultural tensions need to be brought to the fore in discussing this. And I think I can answer it in just a few moments, or at least expand upon it. So first, I think we have overlapping systems of cultural values that are brought together in the Odyssey. All right. And the first that you point out is that distinction between, again, BA and Metis. And what happens in early Greek myth, and in fact, this is cross-cultural, is that swiftness of foot becomes a metonym for physical vitality and physical heroism. Right. And that this is true becomes so clear from the fact that in mythical systems, Achilles dies because of a foot wound. Right. That foot is the metonym for his physical vigor. Right. And we can see the obverse of this in characters like Hephaestus and Oedipus, both of whom are marked out for their intelligence and their ability that is explained by harmed feet. Right, by broken or maimed feet in some way. So you have this latent cultural discourse that to be lame means you get compensation for intelligence to survive, but intelligence means you don't necessarily have physical force. Okay, so that's already latent. And I think that that is absorbed really into discourse of class, right? What's important about Odysseus is that he's somebody who's gone between both worlds. He can have force and intelligence. And in a way, I think Odysseus answers on the human realm, the great myth that we get in the divine realm in Hesiod's Theogony. And this might seem like a big leap, but I hope you guys will stick with me for a minute on this. So in the Theogony, one of the big tensions is about gender. Right? Women are weak but smart. Male figures are powerful but stupid. Right? And this goes through two generations with Uranus and Gaia, then Cronus and Rhea. There's always this replacement Because the male is stupid and forceful, and the female uses cleverness and her ability to use or to capitalize upon her children to overthrow him. But Zeus overpowers this, or that stops this, because he eats his wife Metis, right? Essentially, he impregnates her, then he eats her, he harnesses the female power of reproduction, and then gives birth. So Zeus stabilizes the universe by becoming something of a hermaphrodite, right? He can give birth, he has overpowering strength, he also represents alliances across different generations. Now, this doesn't map easily or evenly onto the world of man because Odysseus isn't going to have babies, right? But symbolically, when he inhabits both intelligence and Metis, he really sort of reflects that power in Zeus. He reinforces a world in which the male is still prominent, and reinforces that even if you are intelligent, you still are noble if you're an agent, and you still have this heroic physical background as well. And again, if we sort of compare Oedipus and Odysseus, Oedipus, even though he's really intelligent and even though he was a great hero, has some sort of essential corruption in his narrative that Odysseus doesn't. So I just probably went too far there rambling, but I think we're deeply connected in cultural discourse that moves in a discrete and not always logical way.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you, Maria.
Georgia, I see your hand there.
Thank you so much. It was really very inspiring, and I liked very much the dichotomy between Iliad and Odyssey and how you presented the different value system if we acknowledge that there will be a potential for such. I would have some remarks, if I may. Even in the Iliad, Hephaestus has this very important role. He symbolically, he's the manufacturer of Achilles' armor.
Right.
Without that, he's impotent as a little ant. So this is, I think, a very important twist. And even, you know, in his worship in antiquity, he's the blacksmith of the gods. You know,
right.
You cannot get more potent than that. You know, in Athens, he's the, in a way, the other side of Athena, kind of on the level of worship. Of course, we have the problem with beautiful forms, beautiful bodies, and Achilles gives sets a standard. It's a very high standard, obviously. What happens to Thersites is not, let's say, is not to be compared with what happens to Melanthius gradually, because obviously he only gets beaten up. Achilles, I think, cannot have the same. You know, Achilles can say anything because he's on one. He's on the same level with the others. Thersites, in a way, violates the order.
Right. Yeah.
And I think this has a certain consequence. With Melanthius, the whole situation in the palace for me is a deformity. And because it just, and the handmaids, and this is what Atwood was furious about, and she gave her own version of the story, but, you know, twisted, but still, you know, I understand, let's say, the motivation. But it was akosmon. What happened was beyond any order, beyond any let's say understanding of not only the norm of the value system that in a way should be established in Ithaca, and yes, and Melanthius, by abusing this verbal abuse of Odysseus, in a way echoes the constant abuse of the suitors.
Absolutely.
You know, so in a way, it's not only a scapegoat, but he really has to be demolished in order for him to come back. I like very much, you know, your elaboration on Odysseus' own body, an own human, let's say, dimension of aging. You know, that alone, apart from the disfigure, is an amazing, you know, realization. I'm just wondering about, I don't know, it's just, for example, you know, we mentioned with Bill the disability with Oedipus. He is obviously, he's pinned, you know, in the ankles, he has a deformity. Some interpret this in a way that he's not fully, let's say, able to understand what has happened to his life. So in a way, he's more blinded than Tiresias. But even in antiquity, the disability of blindness, which is, not negotiable, it's disability. Actually, it's not, as you said, it grants the extra ability to see clearly.
Right.
So I think there is this amazing ambivalence between disability and yet understanding and being part of society, being able to contribute. At the same time, you have this, again, discrepancy between people who actually are despite the cosmos and above cosmos. And I think the imbalance there, and perhaps this is the greatest deformity, the imbalance in cosmos as we understand. I'm very sorry. Thank you so much for your time.
No, it's all right. So I would like to answer the many points you brought up, maybe in the order you gave them. So first, I think you're absolutely right that in a full treatment of this theme, I would need to spend a little more time thinking about the Iliad and Hephaestus's position there. Because his cultural position within the epic itself changes radically from book 1 to book 19. In book 1, he's a joke, right? He's the circus freak who entertains the gods to distract them from their troubles. And that sort of sets a baseline that's reflected in Thersites, right? So Thersites is also some type of a freak, right? But the difference is, as you smartly point out, one of them is authorized and has a social position, and the other one is going against the cosmic order, right? Against the order of the universe. But I want to take that to the Odyssey and ask if it's really uncosmic what's going on there. So there are two things I want to mention. One is both in the context of Odysseus being insulted by his servants, both Melanthius and Melantho are shown to abuse him. And this is often argued as an important justification for their mutilation in order to set things in cosmic order again. But neither Melanthius nor Melantho know it's him, one, and two, they're actually both, in modern parlance, punching down, right? Neither of them are actually flighting with or insulting a social figure they shouldn't be insulting, right? Odysseus in disguise is a beggar without home, without identity. So there, it's a really interesting problem about whether or not they're acting uncosmically. So if you can hold, let me go through all of them, because something second happens. One, let's say Melanthius is a bad servant and he needs to be killed. That's fine. But the mutilation is exceptional. And the mutilation of the handmaidens is set as exceptional as well. And Eustathius, the Archbishop of Thessaloniki, points this out when he's reading what happens in Odyssey. When Telemachus and Odysseus are discussing the punishment of the slave women, Odysseus says, "Oh, kill them with a sword." And Telemachus thinks, and he says, "No, I don't want them to have a clean death. I think they should die by hanging." So Odysseus himself gives this option that they could be killed quickly. And Telemachus says, no, it's something worse. And so for me, and not everybody reads the Odyssey this way or Homer, but I think the Odyssey is trying to make us wonder if this is really about good order and if what happens here is really necessary. So I have much more complicated feelings about that moment. And then I know you want to get back in, but on the issue of blindness, what I'm really worried about the cultural value of blindness in myth is that, we're picking out an exceptional type of disabled person in order to paper over the fact that culturally we're intolerant and we marginalize the rest of them. So, Georgia?
Okay, have, let's say, kind of a line of understanding and taking in the order, but I think you're very right, so right in reading it differently in multiple ways, and it's not just a flat text where we can impose, but I somehow am more intrigued by the, let's say, violation of order in the sense of poetry, because what the verbal abuse is not epic poetry. The epic poetry is, and now comes the epic poetry is about eponymous, is about praise, and what they do is the opposite of that. So I cannot but just smile at the fact that there is an imbalance there. And that would be my time. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. All right, do we have time for another, Keith?
I think so. Anyone got one? I don't see any hands. Well, here's one from me.
Okay.
I'm thinking of the description of Odysseus in Iliad 3 when he's spotted from the walls by Helen, and then she's described, or her identification is as corroborated by one of the guys up there. And he says, I think, he doesn't look that great, but he sure can speak well. Something like that. How does that fit in with your...
So what he says is, he looks like a schlub, essentially, right? He's just there looking at the ground, holding his staff. But when he speaks, his words are like a snowstorm, right? So yeah, I think that this is really, in a way, prolepsis for Odysseus in the Odyssey. Like, this is a man who does things through speech, and it's also enforcing a type of characterization that's important from Book 2. Right? In Book 2, Odysseus alone is really sort of responsible for saving the Achaeans from fleeing to their ships, and he does this in two ways. Right? One, by enforcing social order. He beats lower class people, and he tries to restrain kings with words. So he is someone, I think, to support sort of George's argument there about cosmic order and Odysseus, he's someone who's really about putting things in order, right? But again, the people who are viewing him from the outside, right? This is Antenor and Helen who are describing him in this way. And it's Antenor, I think, who describes him as not looking impressive till he speaks, right? I might be wrong on that. But no, in a way, I think that this is a really important sort of inter-epic intertext, confirming a conventional, traditional characterization of Odysseus as one who has power over speech and intelligence, not necessarily physical force.
Thanks. Any last questions or comments? We're about an hour. Oh, sorry.
Yes, if I may. If I could pick up on something that Bill commented on before he had to leave, and a further thought of mine. Bill talks about Nestor in the Iliad, who is aged and he's not as strong as he used to be, although he can still, lift a huge bowl that no one else can and stuff like that. And he still gets to be good. He's very eloquent, and it's that speaking that is retained. Absolutely. And then I was also thinking, in terms of, how Odysseus is made to look old as well as socially inferior, and comparing it with Laertes. Where does he fit into that picture?
So I think Nestor in many ways he both confirms but acts as an exception, right? So there are no other old people around as test cases or to confirm his sort of symbolic content, but he is mostly effective through language or words. And I think we can make a cultural argument that in a way he echoes what happens to Tithonus, right, in the Homeric hymn to Aphrodite. He just gets older and older. You just hear his voice, right, chattering along. Nestor can still fight. He can still pick up a big bull. But notice when he's marked as still being strong, it's about consumption, right? It's about eating. It's not about heroic activity. When it comes to Laertes, Laertes is a fascinating character who's completely marginalized. And the only thing he does of physical note is when he kills someone at the end of the epic, when he feels like he's young again and he throws that spear. And I'm not quite sure what to make of that, right? I mean, Laertes represents a figure who's literally physically marginalized by his aging and his loss of position in society. So there are ways in which it confirms a picture that losing heroic vitality means you lose your position in the world. But Laertes in the Odyssey is so much more complex than that. Why is he there? Why isn't he king? What is going on with him? I'm not sure at all. So
he's still tending the orchard.
He is.
Even if he can't physically do anything else. And that's kind of new growth and vitality of a different kind.
But when Odysseus goes there and they talk about the orchard and the trees, they are stories that confirm the identity and the shared past they have together. There's this great fragment by Simonides where he says that Hesiod is a gardener and Homer is a weaver of crowns. And I really think that Laertes here at the end of the Odyssey is representing an aged person tending the stories of the past and the patrimony for the future. So he's a caretaker, not an agent of his own.
Nice, thank you.
Thank you. So I think, Keith, you're still muted?
Nope, not anymore.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah, I think all that's left really is to thank you. Thanks so much, Joel. That was really thought-provoking.
Well, I'd love to talk to you guys. I would love to, if you have any follow-ups, my email is really easy. It's joel@brandeis.edu. I talk and think about this stuff all the time. So thank you guys for sharing your time with me. And I hope you have a great day.
Okay. Thanks so much.